Hello, and welcome to Clearer Thinking with Spencer Greenberg, the podcast about ideas that matter. I'm Josh Castle, the producer of the podcast, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. In this episode, Spencer speaks with Stephanie Harrison about misconceptions about happiness, individualism and suffering, and challenging archetypes of emotionality.
Stephanie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So happy to be here with you.
What do most people get wrong about how to be happy?
I think that the idea of happiness has just been painted with all of these different brushes over the years. And so in many ways, it feels like there's this process of unwinding all of those different ideas that has to begin. And I think that one of the biggest ones is how it's really wrapped up in our culture of achievement and idolizing success and viewing that as the pathway to happiness. That seems to be one of the biggest barriers for most people.
It seems that a lot of people feel that they're going to be happy when they get to a certain point in life. Like, oh, if I graduate from my degree, I'll be happy. If I am a successful entrepreneur, I'll be happy. And I think usually they find that that's not the case, that they're not substantially happier in the long run having achieved that. Like, surely they're happy in the moment, right, when they get their achievement, but probably not after that. Would you agree?
Yeah, it feels, like no one's ever going to say that it doesn't feel good to be successful, right? Or to have some progress or a major win or to be recognized. But I think the real key lies in what you're bringing up, which is the fact that it doesn't last. And therefore, it can't be a sustainable source of happiness. You can't place all of your eggs in that basket.
Now, a skeptic might say, well, then maybe life needs to be a series of achievements where you're constantly achieving things and then you can get a boost each time.
It's true. And maybe that is a strategy that works for some people. But I think my question for that person would be, what's the cost of that strategy? Like, how does that affect all of the other areas of your life? Because we live in a very competitive culture that is continuing to only accelerate in that dimension, right? In terms of how much work is required to get ahead and to be successful in the world. And I think that a lot of people would feel and describe the world as feeling harder than ever to get ahead or to be able to improve your station in life, which means that the demands are much higher. And so what are you sacrificing in order to get that constant stream of achievements to boost your happiness?
I agree with you. A lot of people do seem to feel that way. And it doesn't seem to me that likely that really now it's harder to achieve things than it was like 100 years ago. Do you think it actually is?
I think that economically, my understanding of the data is that there is a lot less social mobility in the United States now than there was in the past. So it was easier, for example, to be able to, improve your economic class or to improve your station in life in maybe back in the 50s and 60s. I think that it's certainly in many ways easier to achieve certain things. Like when I think about my career in my life, like I would never have gotten to do the things I get to do were it not for the advent of the internet and the opportunities that created with respect to being able to create things and share my thoughts and all of that kind of stuff. So I think that there are more of these systemic barriers that seem to be in place, but that also there are these other opportunities that have arisen as we've been, sort of progressed technologically.
I can see that. But at the same time, I mean, so many more people get educations today. Women have so much more respect and so much more flexibility than they ever had. There's way less racism. I mean, there's still racism, obviously, but it's like if you look back 150 years ago, it's absolutely shocking the degree of racism. So I don't know. It seems to be hard to believe that it's actually worse, but I don't know. Maybe it is.
I think that maybe like the kind of interesting thing that we're kind of chipping away at in talking about this is also how it feels to people and whether or not, like putting aside the facts and what it means, like if people feel disempowered, they feel like they don't have the support or the institutions or the resources in order to be able to do the things that they want to do. I think that psychologically that's really, really hard on people. And ultimately that experience of feeling like you can't do the things that matter to you, that hurts, right? And so perhaps it's like even just going to the heart of the feeling that people are experiencing and poking and trying to understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute point. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day, the relative comparison of like how hard things were now versus in the past, right? What matters is how you actually feel today. right? And if you feel disempowered, if you feel like you can't achieve your goals, like that is really important, right? Regardless, even if it's much easier than it ever was, right? It would still matter.
Yeah, and it's like obviously like, sometimes I get frustrated by like these like you're completely right to bring this up because like how am I supposed to compare my life as it is today with how it would have been had I been born in, 1920 instead or whatever it is, right? Like there's no control group here. There's no way to be able to really understand that. And I can identify the trends and the likely outcomes that would have happened, and I think about my grandparents and my grandmothers and the opportunities that they had access to compared to what I have. Obviously, it's a world of difference. And yet this crisis of hopelessness and of feeling like there are huge barriers in place for people getting what they need and what they want, I find that really interesting and important to attend to.
What do you see as some of those big barriers right now?
I think that in many ways, we have been trapped by our ideas of happiness. And I think that's really what sort of has motivated me in my work is like, I remember being in college, I was living in New York at the time, and I was doing these internships, trying to figure out what kind of work I wanted to do and getting on the subway and just looking around and like seeing all these people who just looked really unhappy and distressed and burnt out and all of that kind of stuff. And I remember thinking like, man, like in so many ways, these people are, quote, living the dream, right? They have all of these incredible opportunities and they're presumably working on things that matter to them or providing for their families and finding meaning in that way. And yet, why are we still so unhappy? Like, what is it that's not fulfilling us about this? And I guess I've sort of come to believe over time that when we have this misguided understanding of happiness, if we don't question it, then it's going to affect so many of our choices. And we won't even have the awareness of it because we're essentially acting on almost like autopilot, you know what I mean? And these ideas that persist in our culture about happiness being something you get for yourself, by yourself, through achieving more and more, and it's highly individualistic and very different from what we know from the research of the sources of happiness. I think that has been my hypothesis, at least, is that we have to reorient ourselves towards what really matters. And then once we know what matters, we also need to build a world where it becomes easier to do what matters.
You mentioned individualism, and obviously that's a major part of, for example, American culture. Do you think that actually impedes people's happiness?
I think it does both. I think it can contribute to happiness, but in the current form, in the extreme form that we have here, I think it ultimately is ending up harming us. And so I, of course, staunchly believe that every person is an individual who has unique qualities and traits and who matters for who they are and is, somebody who can self-actualize and pursue the things that matter to them. Where my qualms lie is with the hyper-individualism that we see, which extends that to basically say, like, you're entirely on your own, you're separate from other people, they don't matter, it's only you that counts, you can never struggle or lean on anybody or, be a part of a community that needs you and you should never be inconvenienced, and all of these sort of extreme messages that really seep in. And so ultimately, I think that we've essentially just taken it too far.
Where do you see those messages coming from that you should depend only on yourself, you shouldn't be part of a community, you shouldn't be doing things on other people's behalf?
I see them, honestly, all over the place. I think when I was doing the research for my book, New Happy, I looked into where these messages come from. And what is really hard to disentangle is they're so pervasive. It's really sort of the water that we're swimming in. But some of the studies that I found have tried to trace where these individualistic messages are coming from. And for example, there was one researcher who went through all of these media programs, all of these books, and tried to trace the rise of individualistic language, and essentially found that over the last 50 years, the increase in words like I and me and mine has increased incredibly significantly. They then went and looked at television programming and looked at the messages that come through in, for example, kids' television shows, and found that while in the 80s, a lot of the messaging was much more about, being kind to people and being a part of a community and all that kind of stuff. Over the last 30 years, it's really increased in focus in terms of focusing more and more on the self and the self being the most important thing. And those kinds of studies, I think, are really helpful in pinpointing these specific examples of where it comes through. But even if you think about like how many people suffer in silence, and I think that the impulse that we have, like when we're struggling, when we're having a hard time, I don't think many people at all find it easy to raise their hand and say, I'm having a tough time and I need some help. I know I don't find it easy. I'm not sure about you.
Well, ironically, something that helps me is that I tend to not like to do deceptive things, even when they're like really minorly deceptive. So when people are like, how are you doing? I feel weird saying I'm great when I'm actually not doing well. So, but that's
awesome.
kind of a funny hack.
But that's really interesting, right? Because like that connects it to it sounds like it's a core value of yours to be true, right?
Right. Exactly. You got it.
That's really cool. I mean, I haven't thought about it like that before, but I think that those hacks are really important. Like the way I taught myself to ask for help was realizing that a lot of the experiences of happiness in my life have come from helping other people. And I realized that in closing myself off to letting other people help me, I was actually denying them the chance to be happy, to experience the same joy that I was feeling. And that made me really reflect on the ways in which I was not only, harming myself by not leaning on other people, but also, failing to offer these opportunities to contribute to other people in my life who, love me and care about me and want to try and make me feel better. So I am a big fan of hacks that connect to your values and try to figure out ways of making that easier.
Do you have an example you'd feel comfortable talking about where you felt like you would have benefited talking to friends or sharing it and you didn't, and kind of why you felt that was hard to do?
Yeah, of course. Oh God, I have so many examples. So about like 6 years ago, my partner, who I had just met at the time, came down with a mysterious illness, and we had no idea what was going on. It was very sudden. Like one day he sort of started declining, and he kept getting worse and worse. And I took him to every doctor I could find, trying to figure out, okay, like let's rule out this scary diagnosis and this one. And we just kept coming up blank, essentially. And it was over a year of desperately trying to find these answers to figure out what was going on. And I was in my 20s at the time. I didn't have any sort of experience that prepared me for that. I had never been a caretaker. I had never had to fundamentally disrupt my own life in service to another person. And I also was watching this person who I loved and who was, in the prime of his life and who was the epitome of health suddenly struck down for no apparent reason, and no one could help us. Like no doctors could give us the solutions. And as somebody who used to believe that doctors could always help you, it was very devastating to realize the limits of our current medical knowledge.
Yeah, it's a terrifying situation to be in.
It is, yeah. And I didn't talk about how hard it was. I thought that the best thing that I could do would be essentially to shut up and smile and pretend that I was fine, even though I very much wasn't. And in doing so, I ended up creating a lot of walls and barriers with the people who loved me, because I wasn't, to your point about your values, I wasn't being true to myself. I wasn't sharing my authentic experiences and my emotions and my pain. And when you don't do that, you're no longer connecting in the same way with that person. And I thought that doing that was the way to cope. Like, I had a reason for doing it, even if it was an incorrect reason or it wasn't fully realized or conscious. And if I could go back in time, what I would say to that younger version of myself is like, dear God, like, please go talk to somebody. Please go tell your friends how scared you are and how anxious this makes you feel and how you're worried that you're like going to have to go through this trauma and all of this kind of stuff, and I didn't. And I really wish I had. And it took me a long time to learn that lesson.
I think it's such a tricky situation to be in where you can benefit a lot from leaning on your friends, but a lot of people are afraid of how their friends will react. Either that they'll react in a way that's not helpful or makes them feel bad, or that they'll kind of get overburdened by it, right? If like you're telling your friend all the time about how bad things are for you, like they might just get sick of it and they're like sort of punishing for them. So yeah, how do you think people can navigate that?
I think that, one of the sort of maxims of this hyper-individualism that we're talking about is that other people are ultimately not as important as you, right? You are sort of the center of things, and there's a limit to which you can help other people. And I think that the important thing, the important work we have to do for one another is to find ways to let each other know that we're not burdens, even in our suffering and in our pain and in our needs. And, people are so afraid of being needy, right? They're so afraid of it. It's like, I hear it all the time. The pain of feeling like you're asking for too much or that you're a burden while simultaneously not getting your needs satisfied. Like, why is that happening? It breaks my heart. And I think that for me, at least, it led to a very radical shift in my worldview of realizing how much need there is in my fellow human beings and how important it is that I show up to meet that need where I can and to have other people who are willing to meet my needs in the same way as well. And I think that that shift has transformed my life. And while I think, again, like the kind of conditioning that we've been subjected to would say, oh God, how could that make you happy? It has made me happier. And in many ways, it was a great gift out of that experience.
Something that I think about with friends or even with other loved ones or romantic partners is that you can't talk about bad things every single time you see them. Like it will actually create, I think, a kind of negative pall over your relationship. And it's kind of funny because there was this idea of the critical positivity ratio, also known as the Lasada ratio. I don't know if you've ever heard about that.
Yeah.
But it was in early positive psychology research. They found that, I think that in the theory, it was like 2.9013 positive to negative statements in your relationships, in your life, in your company would lead to like positive results, whereas below that critical ratio of like positive, negative, things would fall apart. And the funny thing is that paper was absolute garbage. It was like one of the worst papers I've ever seen in my life, and it was discredited. That being said, oddly, I think it's right. Not that it's 2.9013, but that it's like actually there's something to this idea that like you need to have enough positive experiences in a relationship relative to negative, like for it to be sustainable in the long term. So that's something I think about is like trying to lean on my friends, but not lean on the same friend every time, like do some rotation, do some balancing. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's so funny. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought that the Gottmans had something where they came out and said that they found in their studies on couples, they found a similar finding, not the exact number, obviously, but something like 5-to-1 positive to negative interactions was predictive of health for the couple. Did you ever hear about that?
That may well be. It doesn't surprise me because it just seems to me that something like this has to be true. That like if you have to, imagine if 90% of your interactions are like upsetting or negative with someone, it's like that's going to be a pretty hard relationship to maintain. And I do think people fear that, but I think if you're a bit like conscious of that, you can just balance it. It doesn't mean that, the ratio. If the ratio is 0, you're never telling your close friend the bad things in your life. Like that's not the right ratio, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think there's something really interesting in this, which I'm just reflecting on now because of your question, which is that I also think we have a bit of a skewed understanding of positive versus negative. And I think that Alex was sick for many, many years, and we had just years of difficult experiences. And there wasn't a lot of wins. Like everything was pretty shit and pretty tough, in a lot of ways. And I think that what sustained us in that time, and we were also very isolated, it was, both of us really just leaning on each other in a lot of ways. What helped us was recognizing that you can have a positive experience that's about suffering, I think. And that recognition, I think, makes it possible to navigate those difficult times with your loved ones, especially if they're going through something prolonged and difficult like that, and still find the joy and the love and the peace and the connection and all the other things that help with well-being, even in those moments.
That's a great observation. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sharing about a negative experience you had could help you and the other person feel closer together and more bonded, and they could feel happy that they're able to help you and all these kinds of things. So yeah, I think you're right to point out that sharing a negative experience doesn't have to be a negative experience for the other person. On the other hand, it can be, and so that's something to be mindful of. Like they may, if you're talking about something very upsetting, it could upset the other person to hear about it. If you're talking about the same upsetting thing over and over again every time you see them, like that could wear on them over time. It doesn't mean you shouldn't share, but it's just something to be mindful of.
Yeah, totally. I think that's really well said. I think that the more that having pain met with love, to me, becomes, as you said, turns it into an experience of, love and connection and all those good things. And so it can be a positive one. I think what people tend to have difficulties and struggles with is more of what you described, like the venting about the same topic and the sense, kind of like helplessness that can feel, or the sense of, people perhaps not being able to help and like feeling helpless. It's almost like, like if I was to come to you and complain about a problem that I was struggling with, maybe it would make you feel like it was a negative experience if you felt burdened by it and you couldn't help me and therefore it wasn't solvable. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think it can be especially frustrating if the friend feels like you're not taking the actions you should be taking. And then it's like, you bring up the same problem over and over again. Let's say you have like a boyfriend that's terrible, right? And just like, and the friend is like, okay, you constantly complaining about your boyfriend, you have a terrible relationship.
Yeah.
That can be really frustrating because it feels like it's sort of like banging your head against the wall.
Yeah. I don't think it's interesting because it kind of ties back to the helplessness thing we were talking about. Like, I don't think people don't like to feel helpless, obviously, but I don't think they also like feeling other people, seeing other people feel helpless. It's very frustrating to witness that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
If you're looking to test or improve your critical thinking, there's an engaging way to do so with clearerthinking.org. By integrating useful insights from psychology and economics into fun, interactive programs, clearerthinking.org helps you to make better decisions, create new habits, and achieve your goals. Whether you have just 5 minutes or an hour, you can use more than 30 interactive tools for free on their website. Try the rationality test, which tells you which of 16 reasoning styles best matches your thinking, or the common misconceptions game to see if you are over or underconfident when you bet on what's fact or fiction. Clearer Thinking's work is based on scientific research about how to shift behavior in the real world. So check out their free tools and tests at clearerthinking.org.
Another thing I found in difficult times when just like things are bad and like when a friend, a close friend asks me like, how are you doing? It's hard for me to be like, I'm great. Maybe I could do that with a stranger where it's obviously just a polite thing, but like, I find that can be good to just do like a really quick catch up on like the bad things at the beginning of the conversation, then move on to other topics. You know what I mean? Like, but like be able to talk about it, but not linger the whole, it's like not the focus of everything, right?
Yeah, totally. It's like, it's sharing what's going on almost in a boundaried way, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's really smart.
Now, changing topics a bit, big theme in your work is how to be happy. Do you think that life really is just about happiness, or should we be trying to do more than just be happy?
I love that question. I think that we should be trying to be happy, but in the new ways that I'm talking about, not in the old ways that we've been conditioned into. And I have sort of wrapped up a lot of things in happiness, including meaning and purpose and contribution and service and authenticity and self-actualization and all that kind of stuff.
So you're using a very broad definition of happiness.
Exactly.
That encompasses like lots of good things. Like would you put like all the good things in life?
All the good things.
Okay.
I'm being a little facetious.
But there's a little asterisk. That's everything. That's good.
I always liked the kind of phrasing of a good life. I think that resonates with people, right? Because it gives you the chance to conceptualize it for yourself, and it can encompass a lot of different things. Like, I don't want to pursue happiness in a way that eschews, like pleasurable experiences or eschews meaning or denies my connectedness to other people. I want to live a life that honors all of the elements of the human experience. To me, that's what a good life is, and trying to find ways to deepen in that understanding and embodiment of it.
I'm glad I asked this up front because I've had such frustrating experiences in life of talking about happiness, only to discover half an hour into the conversation that our definitions were completely different. So we got that out of the way.
I'm so glad.
You mentioned your concept of the old happy. Let's start there. What is old happy? How do you define that? What's wrong with that?
Basically, I argue that we've been, as I mentioned, like conditioned into a pursuit of happiness that's actually making us miserable. And it sort of centers around these three core pillars and ideas that tell us that in order to be happy, we have to perfect ourselves, we have to achieve certain societally approved or culturally approved goals, and we have to do everything by ourselves. And the core sort of values that underpin that include things like perfectionism and competition and extrinsic achievement and isolation and hyper-independence and all of that kind of stuff. And so those core values that we end up chasing, thinking that they'll make us happy, I argue that they backfire and end up making us quite unhappy instead.
Do you see this fundamentally linked to capitalism?
Yes, I do. I argue that a lot of these beliefs stem from the ways in which living in a, extremely capitalist society like we do, and the values that it inculcates in us and the way it forms our behaviors and all of that kind of stuff. So I link old happy to individualism, which we talked about, capitalism, and then domination being, the oppression of other human beings, or the ways in which we view ourselves as being in this competition for a sense of worth and therefore well-being.
I don't know if you agree with this, but I feel like capitalism is such an interesting double-edged sword because it creates tremendous wealth, which I do think has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in an amazing way. And you see like how China has developed, and there's so many fewer poor people than there were. And I think capitalism, despite it being China, I think actually a lot of it is due to capitalism. But at the same time, capitalism creates consumerism. It creates this sense of social comparison. It creates frivolous pursuits towards, whatever the other person wants, you want it too, because you see it on television, right? So it's like, it comes with all these really bad side effects.
I agree completely. Like there are obviously those amazing benefits of the economies that we've created and how they have, like, obviously being poor is terrible for your well-being, right? Like we need to create the conditions for everybody to be able to experience the ability to afford what they need and to be able to survive. And I think, so I agree. I do think it is a double-edged sword, and I try to be careful about acknowledging that whenever I talk about it.
We talked about achievement and individualism a bit. Let's touch on self-perfection. How do you see that fitting into capitalism?
I think that in many ways, we've witnessed this sort of commodification of the self and this really interesting approach to selfhood. And there's this scholar who wrote about this back in the 60s. His name is Philip Cushman, and he called it the formation of the empty self, and how the self being construed in this form as being empty means that it has to be filled up, and it has to be filled up with stuff and with the accoutrements of a successful person and through your achievements and all of that kind of stuff. And because those things don't bring us the meaningful, lasting well-being that we're looking for, we're always being depleted, essentially, right? It's like that short-term high we talked about around achievement. It might make you feel good for 10 minutes, but then it goes away pretty quickly. The empty self powers the economy, because if everybody needs to continually fill themselves up, there's always a market for stuff and for more things and for whatever new invention we're being sold that we're told that we have to do in order to perfect ourselves. And I think that really ties into the way that we now treat ourselves as like personal brands who have to do all of the things and, look a certain way to be taken seriously and all the rest of it, and how we are constantly chasing this better version of ourselves. And we think if we can get there, then, yay, finally we'll be happy.
As a man, it's a lot easier to kind of critique this and see it from the outside. But if I look at like the beauty industry, it just seems shocking to me the amount of pressure that women feel to be beautiful all the time. And like, with makeup, with clothing, with high heels, all of these things, and men feel way less this pressure. So it's kind of like sitting here as a man, I just like looking at it, I'm like, wow, that is an intense amount of pressure to experience.
It's wild. Like I wasn't really on the internet, kind of in the 2020 to 2022 timeframe, just because I was going through all those challenges that I mentioned and just really busy with that. So I didn't have any sort of personal presence on social media. And I remember when I kind of came back to it, I was just shocked at how intense the pressure felt even then, like how renewed it was. And I kept wondering, I'm like, is it because people in the pandemic were like, oh, I'm gonna, use this time to like really amp up my appearance, and there was all these trends going on about weird body parts that women have and how to fix them, and every person has talking about their cosmetic procedures and how you have to do this and that in order to look a certain way. And I just felt so overwhelmed by it, and like the pressure that it places upon people. The fact, like, I don't know if you've seen this, but the fact that there are, like 9-year-olds going to buy these mature women's skincare products because they're worried about the wrinkles under their eyes, like that makes me feel sick.
Yeah, it's really wild. And I think that men have other forces, right? It's not that they're immune to these kinds of forces, just that they're kind of operate in different ways. It's less about beauty. Maybe it's more about achievement or achieving some level of status in society or being a good provider or these kinds of pressures.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I mean, with men being the ones who die at the highest rate by suicide, and it gets relatively little attention, the fact that most men don't have anybody except for their spouse who they trust and can confide in, the fact that loneliness rates are the highest among men, right? Like this pressure to do all of those things that you're talking about, as well as the other thing I would mention being like being able to be vulnerable and share your emotions and how painful that is.
Yeah, I think it's pretty hard to deny that men have a harder time talking about their emotions, or at least less of a propensity to do so.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are multiple forces going on. I think one force, on average, men are a little bit less likely to feel intense emotions. And that's probably a factor. It's not a huge difference, but if you look at differences between men and women, that is a small difference between them. I think another factor is that there's this conception of being manly, which a lot of people aspire to. And the conception of manliness involves a certain level of like independence and strength, and maybe talking about your emotions kind of works against that. Like I when I was in high school, I could totally see a kid being made fun of for like talking about their feelings too much, or, it's like, or someone could be like, oh, you're such a girl or whatever, you know what I mean? Like that kind of feeling.
Yeah. Like the fact that kids used to tease boys for showing their emotions and then, saying that they were girly or any other kind of like harmful thing or whatever it is. It's so devastating because having somebody to talk to about your emotions makes all the difference in the world. And I feel so sad thinking about all of the sort of pent up suffering and pain that's being hidden within people who don't have somebody who they can talk to about it.
Yeah, I think, there might be some people who can kind of work through their emotions all on their own, but I think for most people, they kind of have to talk about them to work through them. It's just something, a thing about humans.
I agree. And I think, again, like tying this back to sort of these ideas of, oh, you have to do everything by yourself. Like we've sort of been sold these ideas, and I lay a lot of the blame here also, like talking about where those messages come from self-help content and the ways in which we teach people about this stuff. It's all very grounded in an individualistic worldview. And what that means is that even if you go out there trying to improve your mental health and you've taken the brave, proactive step on doing that, then you're being taught that in order to do that, you should be doing it by yourself rather than doing it through co-regulation or in a community or having a safe place to share. And I've been really encouraged by the rise in things like men's groups and communities that are creating space for people to share, because I think that offers another dimension of healing that's really important.
Do you think there's a positive trend in that direction of men being more willing to share?
I do. I've really noticed it. Have you?
Yeah, I get the sense in the younger generations, like Gen Z, that there's sort of more acceptance of male emotionality.
Yeah, and I think that, like, looking around at some of my, as a millennial, like looking around at some of the men my age that I know, I see them doing a lot of work to unpack those messages. And I wish that they didn't have to. Like, it's a lot harder when they've been internalized, but I just see so much progress in the fact that they want to and they're trying. And it's almost like they're opening up to realize that they deserve that too. Like, they deserve that level of emotional support and to feel like I can talk to my friends about the things that are hard or embarrassing or, stressful. And obviously, women have really leaned on that instinct over the years, and I think that it's been attributed in studies to be one of the things that helps women with their longevity and with their overall well-being, as well as the ability to lean on their friends and talk about those things.
Do you have any advice for how to broach these kinds of subjects for people that don't feel super comfortable talking to their friends about their emotions?
Yeah, I think that the most important thing, the thing that's going to really help to do this is to feel safe. So if you think about the safety of a relationship being like the mental picture I have is like a circle or something, right? Like you, maybe with your current group of friends, you only feel safe talking about a few topics in that circle. Like you talk about your work, your families, your favorite teams, and the news. Like those are the topics that you regularly traverse. I always think like, what would it look like to expand that circle just a little bit? So for example, if you're comfortable talking about your family with your friends, then maybe you could tell them about something that's a little bit hard that's going on with your family. And the reason why this helps you to feel safe is because you have a bridge there. So if you're always talking about your wife and, how her life is going and all that kind of stuff, maybe opening up about something else that's going on in your relationship with her that you wouldn't normally share is a way to expand that circle. And over time, as you do that and you continually go outward to new topics, you're sort of increasing this space of safety. And once you have enough of a baseline, then you can start adding in new topics like bringing up your mental health or bringing up trauma that you're coping with or difficult experiences in your life that you need help with and asking for advice. But I think that idea of slowly expanding the circle makes it hopefully feel a little bit more approachable for people.
I like the idea of broaching certain subjects, maybe not the most intense emotional subjects at first, and seeing how people respond, seeing if they react in a way that's positive, that's helpful to you, and then you can go into the more intense stuff later when you get the trust. I think that's really nice advice.
Thanks. I mean, I'm not sure how it's been for you, but I know in my own experiences, like it's easy to be cynical, right? To say like, oh, I can't bring that up. It's going to be too much for them, or they won't be able to cope with it, or I'm too scared, whatever it is. Like we write ourselves off before we get started in a lot of moments. And I like to think about like, give them a chance to be there for you, right? And if you do, I've had amazing experiences in my life where I've tried to give somebody a chance to show up for me, and they did, and it ended up changing the trajectory of our relationship.
Yeah, I mean, you might be really positively surprised in some cases, and it can actually really bring you much closer together.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. Like, and it does take a leap of faith, so like make the leap small. Make it small enough so you feel comfortable jumping over.
This conversation reminds me, I once read a tweet that had gotten a lot of likes and attention that was something like, it's only acceptable for a man to cry like when his father dies or something like this. And I was like, this is such an insanely toxic
oh my gosh
viewpoint to put in the world. And it shocked me how much attention it was getting.
Wow. People supporting it.
Well, it's hard to say, but it was going viral, and it maybe a bunch of it was retweets of people being like, this is terrible advice, but it was going viral, right?
It's wild though. Like I've recently been working through and watching a bunch of old movies, like kind of the best movies. And I never really did that when I was younger. And so we've been watching a bunch of the old Westerns and, like just the image of masculinity that's presented there of, as you described, like that stoic person who handles it all himself and, copes with pain by just gritting their teeth and pushing through it. Like, I really think that messaging is still out there for men.
I think that we form archetypes. And then when we have an archetype, we want to differentiate them from other archetypes, right? So you get this archetype of like the ideal man, the archetype of the ideal woman. And there's like some tension to make them farther apart from each other, right? And so like it exaggerates the differences. And so like the ideal man is like super manly and super unfeminine. Any feminine features you want to strip out of it. But like actually the ideal person has elements of both, right? It's like, it's crazy to have an ideal man and an ideal woman. Like, doesn't make any sense.
That's so insightful, isn't it? Because like that polarization then ends up making everybody feel inadequate.
Yeah. Or just having certain valuable parts of themselves that they're asked to suppress for some reason.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I remember growing up, like I was always called bossy, right? Like, and too outspoken, too opinionated, etc., all of those things. And it made me really hide away inside of myself and shy away from expressing any sort of assertive nature that I had. And even now today, decades after those experiences, I still have to battle against that all the time. That feeling of, oh God, like people aren't going to like you if you're bossy. You better be more chill or whatever it is. And carrying that, we carry those things with us, don't we?
I think that women politicians in the US are in a really tricky bind where I think there's a lot of pressure to be very cold almost and tough to kind of counterbalance sort of perceptions that they're going to be weak or, flightier or whatever if they're not that way. And I think that like you can see this in Hillary Clinton, especially of like the archetype that she pushed herself into is really not a very pleasant archetype, but it seems like it was like a protective mechanism because it's like, well, what other archetype is she going to go into, right? Is she going to be sweet and docile? No, obviously not, right? Like people are going to be like, well, she can't stand up to Putin, right? It's like, it's really tough.
Yeah. So interesting. Like, you're right. Like, I want to see like men who are able to cry whenever they need to cry. And I want to see women who are empowered to lead when they want to lead. Like, I want us to have a world where all of that is possible and we can just be our human selves rather than feeling like we have to get slotted into one of those different archetypes. And maybe like I don't know, I'm curious to hear what you think, but maybe the only way to accomplish that is through coming up with new archetypes and then expanding them enough so that people start to see themselves in more and more different versions of these images.
Yeah, I guess I think about it as for each person there's an archetype. Like there's the ideal Stephanie and there's the ideal Spencer, right? And like part of life is like trying to move into the more ideal version of yourself, but it's sort of uniquely you in a way. Like your ideal archetype is probably, might be different than everyone else on earth, or maybe there's some other people that have the same one, but it's like not that many.
Yeah. That's such a freeing thought though, isn't it? Because it means that you don't have to put yourself into one of those boxes. You can just be who you are, and I think we'd be so much better off for that.
Yeah, and I think about, for myself, the ideal me is a me that acts even more in accordance with my values, that corrects my flaws that stand in the way from me achieving the things that I care about, right? So it's sort of like, it's still me, but it's just sort of amped up in positive ways and with some of the, rough edges smoothed away.
Your rough edges are great and totally acceptable. I know exactly what you mean though. Like it's like the deepening of your character, right? And continuing to cultivate that. That's really, I think, something important to strive for.
So jumping back to what we were talking about before, we mentioned the old happy. What is the new happy?
Funny, because we've sort of been touching on it in a lot of ways. I argue that real happiness comes from, one, being who you really are, and two, using who you are to help other people.
And why that? Why focus on that rather than, you can imagine other definitions of happiness that are like, figure out what's deeply meaningful for you and go after that, or, other options, right?
Yeah. When I was doing the research, I came across this paper that found and tried to document the hundreds of definitions of happiness that have been proposed throughout history. And I thought it was so interesting because it shows how hard it is to describe these things in a way that, one, gets people to agree on it, but also two, that captures it. And so my attempt is equally as inadequate as any other attempt. I would say that, straight up, that I'm doing my best to put words to something that might be simply impossible to capture in words.
But you're not trying to define happiness. You're trying to give a recipe for happiness, right?
Yes, exactly. And you took the words right out of my mouth. Like, how do you do it? And what does that look like? And all those other definitions, like sometimes they take an approach of like, happiness is subjective well-being, like the number of positive experiences you have and your overall view on life. Some of them take it in the direction I am, which is here's the pathway to follow in order to do it. And then some of them try and describe it as the, like the subjective experiences and what you get out of it, or even the the outcomes of pursuing happiness and how that contributes to things like self-esteem or, better relationships or whatever it is. So the reason I chose those is because in all of the work that I did, I started just to notice these patterns coming up again and again. And I noticed that over and over again, the focus was in people who were describing their experiences of happiness, in scientists who were describing pathways to happiness, that there was always one the acknowledgement of both the self and then the context of the self, whether that's their relationships or the community or the environment, and then the pursuit of personal growth for the self and how that connects to their broader context, and then how to navigate those relationships between the two of them. And so basically, I just started noticing this pattern coming up again and again, and then I started collecting research around it, trying to back it up and show, like, here's the evidence into these different elements. And ultimately, I wanted to provide people with something that was simple enough that they could follow and actually apply it in their lives. And so that's how I landed on those two.
Science is built on replication. Our confidence that a particular hypothesis is true increases the more times we can conduct experiments and get results that are consistent with the original research. Unfortunately, psychology and other social science fields have been undergoing a replication crisis for the past several years, meaning that researchers have tried but failed to replicate experimental results from the past few decades. And this is deeply troubling because it calls into question many of the things we thought we knew about how humans work. To help solve this replication crisis in psychology, the team at Clearer Thinking has launched a project called Transparent Replications that seeks to celebrate high-quality research while also shifting incentives toward more replicable, reliable methods. They accomplish this by conducting rapid replications of recently published psychology and human behavior studies in prominent academic journals, with the aims of celebrating the use of open science best practices, improving reliability, and promoting clarity. Once the Transparent Replications team has completed a replication, they make their results freely available on their website for anyone to read. To read those results and other essays by the team, visit replications.clearerthinking.org.
Yeah, it's nice how short and simple it is. Be who you are, use it to help others. What does be who you are mean, though?
Great question. So there's a number of different elements here. I like to break it down into self-acceptance. So learning how to treat yourself as worthy and deserving of good things, and learning how to integrate difficult experiences into your sense of self and kind of pursuing that sense of wholeness. There's also the discovery of the unique things that make you you. So those could be, I call them your gifts, but, other languages, character strengths or talents, or, whatever else is preferred, your preferred language. And then the cultivation of that, because as we were talking about just before, like, you're not a stagnant thing. You always have the opportunity to grow. And so being yourself is also an active process of what you choose to put your attention on and pursue and develop and cultivate within yourself. And then that in turn is what equips you to be more effectively of service to other people.
And then the second piece of it, using it to help others. Why the focus on helping others rather than, say, helping yourself?
Because I think that the ways in which we have been conditioned to see ourselves as being separate from others is ultimately the greatest source of our unhappiness. And when we think about help, whenever I talk about help, people sort of default to thinking I'm talking about like charity or volunteering, basically. But I try to take a much broader perspective on help, which is essentially seeing it as any action that contributes to another person's well-being. Some of those acts of help are obvious, right? Like, you invited me on your podcast. That's an act of help. That was really kind of you, and I'm super grateful for you. Then somebody listening to this, hopefully getting something out of our conversation, maybe they will be helped by that act, but I'm never going to know about that, and you might not either unless they choose to reach out to you.
Hopefully they'll email you and tell you.
Well, I hope they email you. That's more important. You're the one doing all the hard work. But like, all of these little actions that we take, they add up to creating, hopefully, a world where more and more people are able to experience well-being. But that's not a default. That's something we have to do. It's something we have to devote ourselves to. And I think in many ways, our sense of loneliness, our sense of despair, our sense of helplessness, our sense of loneliness, like, all of these things are the result of thinking that we don't owe anything to anybody. And I think that we owe a lot to everybody. And we all have a role to play in contributing back to that and being a part of that system of interconnectedness. And so when we share ourselves with others, we don't just get the benefits of the growth and the self-esteem and the development of those talents, but we also get the sense of purpose and meaning and of knowing that our lives are useful and knowing that we're making a difference in the world.
This reminds me of a Steve Jobs quote that I really love, which is, "I grow little of the food I eat, and of the little I do grow, I did not breed or perfect the seeds. I do not make any of my own clothing. I speak a language I did not invent or refine. I did not discover the mathematics I use. I am protected by freedoms and laws I did not conceive of or legislate, and I do not enforce or adjudicate." And at the end, he says, "I love and admire my species, living and dead. I am totally dependent on them for my life and well-being." And then funnily enough, it says "send from iPad" at the end.
I remember that. I just love that quote so much. I use that quote in my book. I love it. Yeah. So yeah, you got it. You nailed it. Like, if I take his words and I think about my own life, I am brought to my knees in terms of what has been given to me and all of those contributions that I have benefited from. And when I feel that way, I feel so motivated because I want to do the same. I want to give back in return. I want to try and make the world better for other people. And I want my actions and my energy and my efforts to matter. I want to feel like they're going somewhere and making something bigger than just my own self-interest. And ultimately, in many ways, I think that our happiness problem is really like ultimately stemming from that.
So when you talk about our separateness being this really core aspect of unhappiness, what is the opposite of that? Are you talking about communities? Are you talking about deep friendships? Are you talking about romantic relationships? Are you talking about being connected to strangers?
I think all of it, to be honest. Like, I think the best word is interconnectedness and interdependence. And that can take many different forms, but ideally it would manifest through all of those different types of relationships. So the relationship that I have with my partner is obviously going to be really different than the one that I have with my neighbor or the person who works at the coffee shop that I see when I go there. But that doesn't mean that relationship with the person I'm less close to isn't valuable and important and worthy of care. And then more broadly, our interconnectedness is the human species, and even more broadly than that, with all beings and with our planet and how dependent we are on each other. I think that I find that the recognition of that dependence that we have, to me, is almost like a sacred perspective on life that has fundamentally shaped the way that I treat myself, the way that I treat others, and hopefully the way that I show up for them as well. And the more that I can find those relationships of mutuality and of care and of giving and receiving, I find myself growing in greater happiness.
So suppose a listener is sold on your recipe to happiness, right? They need to work on being who they are and using it to help others. Where do they start? Like, what are some steps they can take that are actionable?
I think I highly recommend starting to figure out what your unique gifts are, because that can be the bridge for both of those two pillars. One of the exercises I have people do when they, come and learn about the philosophy is I ask them to reach out to 5 people in their lives and ask them to reflect on that person's gifts and, share examples or things that they've noticed. And I give them prompts and scripts to use because everybody finds it so incredibly uncomfortable. And I think that even if you do find that a little scary, if you can harness your courage and do it, you will be amazed at what you find, because so often we are very poor judges of our own capabilities. We take our amazing strengths for granted and we think that they naturally, they come easy to us. So of course, everybody can do those things. And we also don't notice strengths that we have within us. And so I think that that's a really great first step of simply reaching out, asking for this feedback. And then once you get it back, thinking about how you can start to use some of those things that were called out in your daily life. You don't have to quit your job. You don't have to change your whole life. You can just start trying to bring those gifts more to the forefront in your activities.
So what's an example of a message you might send to get this feedback?
I run this like free book club where we kind of go through this together. And so I always tell them they can blame me. And so I gave them a script that says something like, hey, I'm in this book club and the leader is forcing me to ask 5 people about my strengths. And I was wondering if you could take a minute and tell me about it.
Can the podcast listeners do that? Could be like,
Yes.
Stephanie Harrison forced me to.
She forced, I'm demanding every single person listening. You better do it or you'll be in trouble.
So then you ask about 5 strengths they think you have?
Yeah, 5, and some of the, depending on the language with your loved ones, you could say 5 strengths do you think I possess? Could you tell me about times that you've noticed I look alive or seem really happy and energized? Any particular traits that you appreciate in me? Things like that.
How do you see this as connecting to Martin Seligman's work on character strengths?
I think that it's really related to it. I think where I differ on character strengths is I think that I've been calling something similar gifts of humanity, which is, who you are as a person. I think I really appreciate the work on character strengths and all of the amazing research that's been done. I think that we have the capacity for all of those strengths. And unfortunately, in the work that I've seen and trying to use that method with people, it hasn't connected with people in the way that they've really been able to take it on and internalize it. And I'm not sure what that is. I don't know why it doesn't quite catch people in those ways. And so I wanted to try offering a different spin that maybe would be more adaptable or approachable for people.
For those that haven't heard about it before, Seligman's character strengths tries to capture the kind of virtues that are across many societies, like appreciation of beauty, bravery, creativity, curiosity, or fairness, forgiveness, gratitude, and so on. And he has a test where you can kind of learn about your character strengths.
It's great. It offers a really nice framework for people and breaks it down into those different dimensions. And I think I've broken gifts up into these 3 different buckets. So the first is humanity strengths, which encompass a lot of the character strengths, but not all of them, and has a little bit of a different split. The second is your gifts of wisdom, which is what you know from your unique life experiences and all of the things that you've learned along the way. So each of us has navigated a completely unique life, and along the way we've captured a lot of important lessons and information. And I think of those as important gifts that can be shared. And then the third is your talents, so the things that you can do. And that's maybe it's something that's innate to you, maybe it's something you've trained yourself at, but those talents are, most often cultivated through practice and effort and all that fun stuff.
It's neat to think that everyone has these 3 things they can draw on, right? Their humanity or character strengths, their wisdom or what they've learned in their lifetime, and then their talents, like the things they're good at. So I think that's really nice framing.
Thank you. I talk to people a lot who feel like they have nothing to offer. And it really breaks my heart because everybody has so many amazing treasures within them. And I wanted to give people that sense of giving them a way to discover them. And just to understand how wonderful and unique and special they really are. And hopefully that can give them the tools to help them build upon those, to be able to take their life experiences and turn them into more of those gifts, and then to find ways to share them.
Do you find a lot of people that read your work have imposter syndrome?
Everybody.
Wow, that's a lot.
I don't know if I've ever met a person who doesn't have imposter syndrome.
Oh, I don't have imposter syndrome. If anything, I have the opposite.
You're my first person. This is so exciting.
That's crazy.
Tell me more.
I've always believed could do things that I definitely can't do. Like I've always just assumed, oh yeah, if another human can figure out how to do it, I can figure it out, and which is clearly false.
That is awesome.
Honestly, it kind of works for me. Like I've been trying to tamp down on it to become more calibrated about what I'm capable of. But it also kind of has some advantages where it gets me to try hard things.
What do you think made you that way?
I don't know. Honestly, I've always been that way. I can't remember a time I wasn't that way. So no clue.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's like, is it innate? Is it part of like your childhood? It's fascinating to think about that.
Yeah, and not all of my siblings are like that either. So I don't know.
Fascinating.
Hard to make sense of. But why do you think so many people have imposter syndrome? I mean, it's kind of wild that you find it's almost ubiquitous.
I think that if you've always been taught to value yourself based on how you stack up to others, there's always somebody higher up, in quotations, that you can compare yourself to. And so no matter how far you go, no matter what you achieve, no matter how successful you are, you always can look around and find somebody else who's better than you. And that's one element. The second element is the incredible hollowness of the sense of self that's cultivated in our culture, that empty self we were talking about, like feeling this very fragile sense of self-esteem and looking around for things to fill that up rather than believing in yourself. And then I think the third thing is a wild misunderstanding of what is required in order to do things. And I think that there are a lot of people who think that if it doesn't come easy immediately, then they're not meant to do it. And therefore, they end up feeling like I'm not capable of doing the things that I want to do.
It's funny, that reminds me of a theory I have about why so many people like hate math or are stressed out by it, including a lot of like really, really smart people who were really good in school. And I think part of it traces to the fact that if you're in history class or English class, like you never really are that confused. You know what I mean? Like maybe your attention disappeared for a minute and you're not really sure what they're talking about, but like they're speaking in English, right? Like, you have like the basic gist of what's going on. In math class, like you can like miss something at the beginning of a class and literally have no idea what's happening the rest of the time. It's like an alien language.
It's so true.
Yeah. And as a mathematician, like I've had so many classes throughout my life at every level, undergrad, grad, and, when I'm doing my PhD, where I was like very deeply confused. And that's just sort of like, that's just normal in math, actually. This just turns out, unless you're like an incredibly gifted prodigy, that's just part of the experience. But like people are not ready for that.
No, I totally endorse your theory. That makes perfect sense to me. And like one other point of evidence is my partner Alex is a designer, and he is like single-handedly responsible for helping me to overcome a lot of these beliefs, because I was like that when I was in high school. I could not cope with math because I couldn't cope with how difficult it was. I didn't have any of the emotional regulation strategies to be able to sit with my discomfort. And so I would give up or I would tap out, and then I'd lose track and I'd be lost for the rest of the year, basically. And I didn't realize, no one ever taught me that the struggle is how you get to where you want to go. It's not the thing that you should avoid. You should actually run towards it. And I think that Alex being a designer and like trying to solve tough problems in that way, like so much of design is about sitting with problems that haven't been solved and then trying to come up with new solutions that feel perhaps really surprising or come out of left field or don't make sense to other people right away. And that watching him embrace the struggle of it all taught me that that's where the magic is. And having avoided the struggle for so long, I had to really retrain myself to be able to start to face it in a new way.
Honestly, I think people would be a lot better off if they're told early in math, like, if you understand everything in this, then this is too easy a class for you. You should go to the next class.
That would have made me feel so much better, though. For real, it would have.
Like you should expect to feel like you have no idea what's going on 30% of the time, at least.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. And like knowing that ratio, my God, that would have brought me so much comfort. Like I feel like what I was taught was, if it doesn't come easy for you, then either one, you're bad and stupid and you'll never figure it out, or two, you're not meant to. So just give up. And then, of course, like third, if you're trying to be perfect, it's a reflection on you if you can't do it perfectly. And then that makes you bad and unacceptable.
Right. And, this is math and, middle school level, high school level, et cetera. But this applies to so many things when we get out of school, where like there are things that have sort of unlimited difficulty. And so if you haven't learned that you can fail and fail and fail and fail, and that's like normal in some activities, and, until eventually you begin to understand it and you come out the other side, then you just might learn that you have to avoid those things that you really don't.
And then you never get to fulfill your potential, right? Like you never get to grow in the ways that you're capable of. And then you don't get to help people who could benefit from those struggles that you go through. And so I think that the embrace of that difficulty becomes so important. And maybe discomfort is a better word than difficulty, because the difficulty part is relative, but we all feel the discomfort when we're being challenged at that level.
There's one reason I like bouldering. I don't know if you've ever done it.
No, I haven't.
You start out and every climb in many gyms is like labeled with like how hard it is, right? V0, V1, et cetera. So it's labeled, it's right there. This is how hard it is. And what happens is you start out being horrible at it, unless you like have some innate talent, right? And you start to get the lowest level at the gym. and you're seeing people, these like people doing godlike behaviors all around you. You're like, oh my God, that's impossible. Like even you start, if you're at like a V0 level or a V1 level, like a V3 seems like literally impossible. Like you can't even conceive how someone could do it. But then you push at it, you push it, and you eventually find yourself doing a V3. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe it. But a V5, that's like only a God could do a V5. Like that's superhuman, right?
I love that.
Really cool.
That's such a great way to describe it. Like I just started trying to learn the piano, and I'm doing it because I want to challenge myself again to sort of sit in the discomfort of it all. And right now, the idea of being able to play a song feels impossible, but I want to persist. And in my better moments, I can remind myself of what you just said and be like, okay, if somebody else has done this, if a child can learn how to play the piano, then you probably can too. You might just find it really hard at first. And that doesn't mean, like, the self-talk I have to use is, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It doesn't mean that you're broken. It doesn't mean that you're never going to get there. It just means that it's hard right now. And that difficulty is helping you to grow. And gosh, I wish I learned that when I was younger.
Stephanie, before we wrap up, I just want to ask, what do you want to leave people with? You know, if there's one thing that sticks in their mind from the conversation today.
I would love to leave people telling them that they are completely acceptable as they are. And more than that, they have so much to offer other people, the world, themselves. And keeping that tucked away, keeping that hidden away doesn't help you, and it doesn't help anybody. And I want to encourage anyone listening to share themselves boldly, because the world needs you and you have the power to make a big difference. And I hope that in doing so, you can discover this different type of happiness that actually lasts and is much more sustainable.
Stephanie, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved our conversation.
Thanks again for listening. We always love to hear from our listeners, so if you have questions or comments for us, just send us an email at clearerthinkingpodcast@gmail.com. This episode was edited by Ryan Kessler and transcribed by We Amplify. Uri Bram is the podcast's factotum. If you like our show, then we'd really appreciate it if you could rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, and tell your friends about us on social media. We also hope you'll subscribe to our email newsletter called One Helpful Idea. Each week, we'll send you one idea that we think is really valuable that you can read about in just 30 seconds, along with that week's new podcast episodes, an essay by Spencer, and announcements about upcoming events. To sign up for that newsletter or to find show notes, transcripts, and more info about the show, visit podcast.clearerthinking.org.